Hi students, welcome to lesson 10 on World War II. And to begin with, we need to look at one of the reasons why the US did not get immediately involved in World War II had to do with this, what historians have called this isolationist mindset in the 1930s. And really this had been a dominant mindset among Americans ever since George Washington's farewell speech, the first president of the United States. Right there, hazelnut. How's it going? Hazel's doing the monkey. That's what we call this. She puts both paws up. Oh my goodness. Anyways, so by default, a lot of Americans thought that it was wiser to avoid foreign entanglements. And this was reinforced by, number one, revulsion against World War I. Many Americans came to believe that they had been manipulated into war by big business wanting to make huge profits and banks wanting to protect their loans to Europe. Books like H.C. Engelbrecht's Merchants of Death were very influential. In 1933, the Nye Committee investigated the issue, and its revelations of business lobbying and profits during the war seemed to confirm this view. There was a widespread conviction that Americans were brainwashed by British and government propaganda. They started looking at those posters that depicted the Germans as Huns, and in hindsight got to thinking, did we go a little bit too far after all? Anti-war novels were also very influential, such as Eric Remarque's All Quiet on the Western Front. Most Americans were determined to never make the same mistake again. In a 1937 poll, 70% believed the U.S. had been wrong to go to war, and 94% believed the U.S. should not try to prevent wars or intervene in foreign wars. And it's interesting because this has been an issue lately with this question of how active the U.S. should be to protect the Kurdish rebels in Syria and intervene in the Syrian civil war. Um, Donald Trump seems to want to avoid that and maybe go back to more of this. I don't know. Seems, I guess you could say, more of a George Washington mindset of it's complicated. We're still allies with Turkey. We kind of had to choose between the Kurds and Turkey, but because both of those sides are not getting along with each other, and I guess Donald Trump ended up siding with Turkey, the NATO ally. Um, but this question of how entangled should the U.S. be still pretty widely debated. So that was an issue. The Great Depression was another issue. Not surprisingly, most Americans were preoccupied with the domestic crisis of the Depression. They thought, let's take care of America's problems first, and then we'll worry about the rest of the world later. There was a lot of racism and anti-Semitism. One reason why Americans did not take Hitler's actions seriously was widespread anti-Semitism, that is to say, prejudice against Jews. Henry Ford published such a virulent anti-Semitic newspaper that the U.S. government had to ask him to stop. Under popular pressure, the American government refused to increase its small quota to allow more Jewish refugees into the U.S. from Germany. In a 1938 poll, 75% of all Americans opposed allowing more Jews in. 66% were against a bill to allow Jewish refugee children into America. And this is at a time when Jews were not just stripped of their citizenship and property, but getting put into concentration camps and getting beat up, in their houses burned and ransacked, like in the Night of the Broken Glass. So, in June of 1939, the St. Louis, a refugee ship filled with Jews, was turned away. So it's kind of interesting, this parallel, how Jewish refugees were treated and how Latin American refugees fleeing gang violence in Central America have been treated. Kind of similar reactions in each circumstance. But nor did Americans particularly sympathize with the Chinese victims of the Japanese Empire. Chinese Americans had long been looked down upon in American society as racially inferior. Reason number 4 for isolationism was that imperialism was not seen as unusual. So what if Japan was creating an empire? Isn't that what all great powers had done? Hadn't Britain and France just recently enlarged their empires after World War I? As far as the Japanese were concerned, it was outrageously hypocritical for Western powers like Britain, France, and the US to criticize Japan for doing what the Western powers had practiced for a long time already. Reason number 5 was sympathy for Germany. The Treaty of Versailles ruthlessly punished Germany, as you know, with the war guilt clause, demilitarization, loss of territory and empire, and reparations. By the early 1930s, Western powers felt increasingly guilty about how they had treated Germany, and they tolerated the rise of Adolf Hitler's National Socialist German Workers' Party, which won 37% of the parliamentary vote in 1932 on a platform of revoking the Treaty of Versailles and scapegoating Jews and communists for Germany's economic troubles. And speaking of communists, reason number 6 for isolationism was anti-communism. Some American observers saw the extreme nationalism of Hitler in Germany and Mussolini in Italy as the lesser evil compared to the powerful German and Italian communist parties. The Italian communists had come close to taking power over Italy after World War I, before Mussolini restored law and order with his vigilante black shirts. And in Germany, the German Communist Party obtained over 15% of the vote during the depth of the Great Depression. Many hoped that Mussolini and Hitler might prove to be useful attack dogs for Western civilization, as long as their wrath could be safely channeled against communists, both at home and abroad in the Soviet Union. Hitler, in particular, had talked in his book, Mein Kampf, about his grand plan to conquer more land for Germany at the expense of the Jewish Bolshevik communists in Russia. If that's where Hitler's appetite for expansion was, then let him have it. This was a common view. A lot of people thought, well, as long as he's not picking on us, you know. Unfortunately, Hitler would prove to be more of a loose cannon and started demanding territory from other countries as well, like Czechoslovakia, Poland. But that wasn't immediately obvious that he would do that. So let's look at this timeline of aggression leading up to World War II. 1931, Japan invaded Manchuria, that is to say northern China. The US did not react. 1935, the remilitarization of Germany. Germany's armed forces rebuilt. Germany reoccupied this Saar region. It's a region of heavy industry that had been a buffer zone between Germany and France in the Treaty of Versailles. And also fascist Italy invaded Ethiopia. The United States passed a Neutrality Act that banned the sale of arms to countries at war. 1936, German troops took over the Rhineland, another buffer zone between France and Germany, what was before a demilitarized zone under the Treaty of Versailles. So once again, Germany's just blatantly violating the Treaty of Versailles, which, technically speaking, could have been cause for Britain and France immediately going to war against Germany right then and there, but they didn't. They let the issue slide. Once again, that guilty conscience. They thought this was compensation for them having been too hard on Germany earlier. And then you had the Spanish Civil War, where General Francisco Franco led a fascist military revolt against a democratically elected leftist republic. Germany and Italy gave military support to the military coup. America remained officially neutral. The elected republic in Spain relied mostly on aid from Mexico and the Soviet Union, and on international volunteers, including the Abraham Lincoln Brigade from America. These idealistic and poorly equipped and trained young men were no match for the fascists, and meanwhile American industrialists supplied the fascists. But the American government was officially neutral in this civil war. In 1937, another Neutrality Act permitted cash and carry in non-military goods only and banned arms sales to the fascist Spanish generals. Meanwhile, Japan invaded China and began its conquest by taking Shanghai and the capital Nanjing. where Japanese troops massacred 300,000 civilians. The U.S. protested when the Japanese accidentally sank a U.S. boat in Nanjing, but accepted Japan's apology and payment of $2 million in compensation. So the hundreds of thousands of Chinese civilians that were killed, the U.S. didn't really protest that. Once again, Chinese were kind of seen as racially inferior. A lot of Americans didn't really care. 1938, Nazi Germany annexed Austria, which from Hitler's point of view was a logical next step, considering Austria was just another German-speaking country that Hitler wanted to unify into his greater German nation. He wanted to unify all the German-speaking people under one government, national unity and strength and all that jazz. And Nazi Germany then convinced Britain and France to put away their defense treaty with Czechoslovakia and allowed Germany to also annex the German-speaking Sudetenland region of Czechoslovakia. This was British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain's policy of appeasement, accepting the annexations in return for Hitler's promise of no more German expansionism. This is the last time, I promise. Of course, later on, just a few months later, in 1939, Hitler invaded the rest of Czechoslovakia, including portions without German-speaking people in them. So this is no longer about just acquiring and governing all the German-speaking people in Europe. This is creating an empire where you're going to be governing over foreign ethnicities as well. Nevertheless, Chamberlain continued his policy of appeasement, accepting the conquest in return for a promise of no more German expansionism. However, Hitler quickly began to demand the handover of another predominantly German-speaking city, the city of Danzig, this time at the expense of Poland. After Poland refused to hand over the city, Germany invaded Poland in September of 1939. This time, Britain and France, who had a defense treaty with Poland, responded by declaring war against Germany, and World War II began. Meanwhile, Germany and the Soviet Union had just previously signed a convenient non-aggression pact between the two of them. The United States responded with an official declaration of neutrality. Once again, the 1939 Neutrality Act allowed France, Britain, and China to buy U.S. arms on a cash-and-carry basis. No loans were permitted, and arms could not be carried on U.S. ships. Think about why that might be the case. If we offer things on loans, we're going to get right back in the situation we were in World War I, where we will start to feel pressure to make sure these countries win so they can pay back their loans. So the U.S. didn't want to have these strings attached that would drag it into another war. Also, if we're carrying arms on our own ships, those ships are going to be targeted as carrying war supplies. So if we want to stay out of this war, we got to make sure our ships aren't carrying this military cargo. So all these precautions to make sure a repeat of World War I, and the U.S. getting sucked into that war would not repeat. 1940, the Nazis conquered most of Western Europe, Norway, Denmark, Belgium, and France, after conquering Poland previous year, and the air battle over Britain commenced, supposedly in preparation for the German invasion of Britain, codenamed Operation Sea Lion, which Hitler ended up abandoning and changing his mind about once it became clear it was not going to work with the British Navy patrolling the waters and probably sinking every troop transport boat. Japan formed the Tripartite Pact with Italy and Germany and began conquering European colonies in the Pacific. So you got the Axis powers that, Germany and Italy, and then Japan basically joins. Despite all that Germany, Italy, and Japan had done to upset the previous world order, by early 1941, isolationism was still strong in the U.S., with intervention opposed by the Republican America First Committee. But Roosevelt began aiding Britain. Surplus World War I warships were swapped for bases in Britain. Roosevelt began preparing for war with the first U.S. peacetime draft also. When Japan invaded Indochina, that is to say Vietnam, The U.S. retaliated with embargoes on gasoline and scrap metal, supplies that Japan desperately needed. As far as the Japanese were concerned, America's use of this bargaining chip was like America holding a dagger to their throat. Resentment escalated between the U.S. and Japan. In 1941, German submarines were sinking many British ships, and Britain had no cash left to buy arms. There was a real risk of British defeat. The Lend-Lease Act allowed U.S. to lend or lease military goods to Britain. So now we're kind of getting roped in again, kind of like in World War I. We're lending supplies once again. But by this point, Roosevelt was looking for a way to get into World War II and help Britain. He just didn't have the support of most of the American people behind him quite yet. But he could see kind of the long-term consequences of if Germany won the war, what kind of negotiating partners would they be? They would be fairly demanding and fairly sort of bullying, it was feared, especially compared to Britain. So he much preferred Britain to win. A lot of this he explains in a speech he gave called the Four Freedoms Address that you will look at in your discussion forums this week. In June, Germany invaded Russia, or the Soviet Union. Lend-Lease was extended to Russia, and the U.S. Navy started to form convoys to protect Allied shipping in the North Atlantic. Japan continued to conquer Indochina. The U.S. retaliated by freezing Japanese assets and by putting an embargo on all trade with China, including the oil that the Japanese depended on. Japan needed the oil of the Dutch East Indies, Indonesia, and wanted to delay U.S. military intervention. The U.S. Pacific Fleet was at Pearl Harbor, so on December 7th, 1941, Japan bombed Pearl Harbor. I highly recommend you watch this video. That kind of really goes in depth into what happened at Pearl Harbor. Immediately, the U.S. declared war on Japan, which soon meant we were at war with Japan's allies, Germany and Italy, especially after Germany declared war on the U.S. To help out their Japanese ally. The United States formed a grand alliance with Britain and an unlikely ally, the USSR. And here I want to talk about the role of the Soviet Union. Very important role in the war, often underappreciated by Americans. Hitler was determined to conquer the vast territory of the Soviet Union. With its massive resources of oil, food, and heavy industry and huge population, an enslaved Russia would make the Third Reich unbeatable. 250 German divisions pummeled the Soviets with massive losses of Russian lives. Russia desperately needed a second European front in France to divert German troops back into Europe. At the Tehran Conference, Churchill and Roosevelt agreed to open a second front within 6 months, and Stalin in return promised to join in the war against Japan once Europe was liberated. But Churchill persuaded Roosevelt to delay the second front, arguing that the Allies needed time to become strong enough to break through German defenses and mount a successful offensive in France. America had to make the transition to a war economy, build up its army, and raise war production to fight in two theaters of war, the Atlantic and the Pacific. The USSR had to take the brunt of war until America was able to play an active role. The U.S. was able to win the war because the Soviets did not lose to Germany. A major turning point of the war was when the Soviets stopped the German advance by winning the brutal siege of Stalingrad. And this video shows how the sacrifices of the Soviet people cannot be stressed enough. The 5-10 million Soviet people who died in the war, versus the 400,000 Americans that died. It's quite a big difference. Overview of the European theater. U.S. forces in Europe were commanded by Dwight Eisenhower, later became president in the 1950s, and the U.S. offensive began in North Africa. After beating Germany's Africa Corps in North Africa, the U.S. and Britain invaded Italy from Sicily up through the Italian peninsula, the so-called soft underbelly of Europe, because the Italians were not as good at defending as the Germans were. Sensing that they needed to get out of the losing side of the war, the Italians overthrew Mussolini's government but German divisions moved in to occupy the northern half of Italy and bottle up the Allies in Italy's rough mountain passes. In Northeast Europe, U.S. and British air forces systematically and intensively bombed German military targets and also firebombed cities such as Hamburg and Dresden, both in retaliation and to destroy civilian morale. The U.S. and Britain built up and trained massive forces in Britain for the planned invasion of Western Europe, codenamed Operation Overlord or D-Day. On June 6, 1944, the invasion of Northern Europe began, with eventually 1.5 million Allied soldiers landing in Normandy by sea or by air. They broke through German defenses, liberated Paris in August, and began heading for Berlin. Germany's last offensive was the Winter Battle of the Bulge in Belgium, where they were eventually defeated. Allied troops moved towards Berlin, with the Russians arriving first from the east. Allied and Russian troops liberated concentration camps and labor camps, and on May 8th, 1945, Berlin was taken, and the war was over in Europe. And nowadays, this is a big holiday in Russia, this Victory Day over Germany. An overview of war in the Pacific. Japan continued to conquer Pacific Rim nations, including the colonies of Britain, France, and the Netherlands, and began to bomb Australia and threaten India. The U.S. surrendered in the Philippines. Captured U.S. soldiers died on the Bataan Death March, up to 11,000 men, which Americans were extremely angry about. And there were posters saying, "You kill every last murdering Jap, who who killed our soldiers on the Bataan Death March." A lot of resentment over that. America sent aid to the nationalist forces in China that were battling Japan. The U.S. rapidly built aircraft carriers, destroyers, and submarines because the war in the Pacific relied on these aircraft carriers and their bombers. In the Battle of Midway, the U.S. got advanced warning of the location of the Japanese Navy. The U.S. obliterated Japanese air superiority by dropping bombs on loaded Japanese aircraft carriers. Japan lost 4 of its 6 aircraft carriers. I recommend watching at least a couple minutes of this amazing amateur documentary on the Battle of Midway. Another great video here. It's kind of long, so if you don't want to watch the whole thing, I understand, but it's really, I don't know, it's interesting too because it's done from the Japanese point of view, with what little information they had of where the American ships are. It really gives it an element of suspense. The U.S. started a strategy of island hopping. Islands were needed to provide bases for air raids on Japanese bases and cities. The U.S. started cutting off all Japanese supplies to Japanese-occupied islands. So not conquering every single island, but skipping some of them, stranding all of their forces on those islands, and moving closer to Japan. The conquest of Iwo Jima and Okinawa, with tens of thousands of casualties on both sides, gave the U.S. closer air bases to Japan. Japanese pilots resorted increasingly to kamikaze suicide missions. Americans feared that Japan would resist unconditionally, surrendering, without a full-scale invasion of Japan, which American planners feared would lead to millions of Japanese and American casualties. However, before those plans got underway, atom bombs were dropped on Hiroshima on August 6th and on Nagasaki on August 9th. Japan quickly surrendered on August 14th, 1945. So what was the role of the federal government in all this? To fight this second total war, the government had the same goals as in World War I, with some important additions. 1, create and supply huge armed forces. Not only an army and a navy, but now an air force. 10 million American men were drafted into war. 15 million Americans served, but only a third of them saw combat. For the first time, large numbers of women were recruited into the American Armed Forces for non-combat duties that would release more men for combat. A Women's Army Corps was created, and women's divisions of Navy, Air Force, and Marines. 350,000 served, mostly back in the United States. 1,000 women pilots flew planes from factories to training bases. The policy of racial segregation for African Americans, however, remained unchanged. They enlisted at a much higher rate than the general population, but faced humiliating segregation at training bases in the South, where they were relegated to inferior quarters, denied access to facilities like the library or theater, and faced hostility from the white civilian community. At war, they had to serve in segregated units under white officers, mostly in non-combat labor, drudgery, basically. Number two is to increase production of food and war materials. As in World War I, new agencies were created to plan all parts of the economy, but no part of the economy was nationalized. Instead, the government served as mediator between private business owners, workers, consumers, and the military. The biggest change was a new policy of stopping inflation. In World War I, inflation had reached 62%, but it was kept to just 8% in World War II. And that's because prices on thousands of items were fixed by law. Raw materials were allocated to each industry. A maximum wage was established in war industries. For this reason, industries tried to attract workers by offering free health insurance and other benefits. That's where the American economy gets that tendency for jobs to offer those sorts of things. Rationing was imposed on meat, butter, coffee, sugar, canned goods, shoes, tires, gasoline, and fuel oil. Part 3 of the federal government's role was the Manhattan Project to create the atom bomb. Part 4, to pay all this, was some extremely high taxes were introduced. Some of it was paid for by war bonds, but mainly income taxes on the wealthy were vastly increased. On incomes over $500,000 a year, the tax rate was increased to 88%. Nowadays, I think people would be crying communism about that sort of thing, but people put up with it out of, I guess, patriotic duty. I don't know. Part 5, propaganda and censorship to keep up morale, which is interesting because even though, it seems like the righteousness of the cause in World War II is a little more straightforward. So why would you need to, go to special effort to make sure people are rallied behind the war effort here? After all, Japan blatantly attacked us. Germany declared war on the U.S. Just to make sure people keep their enthusiasm up over years and years of fighting, to dissuade people from leaking information that they shouldn't be leaking, that sort of thing. Anti-Japanese propaganda was extremely racist, portraying the Japanese as monkeys and rats. This encouraged already high levels of hostility towards the Japanese Americans, which brings us to the Japanese American internment. While Americans had harassed German Americans in World War I, few of those German Americans had been taken into custody. 2/3 of all Japanese Americans had been born in America, but all were suspected of disloyalty and potential subversion on the West Coast. The assets of anyone born in Japan were frozen, and all Japanese men were interrogated. Then Roosevelt issued Executive Order 9066, which removed Japanese Americans from California, Oregon, Washington, and Arizona. Upheld by the Supreme Court on grounds of national security, they were just given 1 week's notice to close up their homes and businesses. They could bring 1 suitcase each. In San Francisco, they had to live in horse stables until the camp was completed. They were taken by bus and train with windows blacked out to internment camps in remote regions where they lived behind barbed wire and primitive barracks. Eventually, some were allowed out to do war work, and young men were allowed to join the army if they signed an oath of loyalty. And Part 7, rallying the labor force. The war ended unemployment, and there was soon a labor shortage, both in industry and agriculture. While 15 million left to serve in the armed forces, 17 million new jobs were created. So, how are you going to fill all those positions? Full employment ended families' financial hardships and led to huge demographic changes. An increase in marriage rates, not just because of wartime romances, but because men could now support a family. An increase in birth rates. Couples could afford to raise a child. An increase in divorce rates, not just those fragile wartime romances, but discontented wives who had had to stay with husbands during the Depression for economic reasons could now earn enough to support themselves without a husband's income. And a high rate of mobility. 9 million Americans moved to new cities for war jobs or to military training camps. This resulted in a severe housing shortage. As in World War I, white men's jobs were now often done by blacks, Hispanics, Indians, and working women. African Americans' great migration resumed as they moved to cities in the north from the south. Initially, even if they were well trained, they were discriminated against in hiring. They were forced to live in the slums and faced open racism in these urban communities. This resulted in nonviolent protests and race riots in nearly 50 cities in 1943. The Congress of Racial Equality formed to combat wartime discrimination and demand equal rights. Philip Randolph, head of the Black Railroad Porters Union, called for a massive Black March on Washington, which, if it had gone through, would have harmed the nation's international reputation. In response, Franklin Roosevelt created the Fair Employment Practices Committee by executive order, which banned discrimination in war industries. And there were still not enough workers, so for the first time in an American war, the government called on the last labor reserve, married white middle-class women who had been taught that they should not work after marriage. A massive propaganda campaign ensued to convince them of their patriotic duty to go to work alongside Rosie the Riveter in war industries. 6 million new women workers, many with young children, joined the war effort. In 1944, 37% of American women had jobs, over 72% of them were married, and over a third of them had children under 14. Women working in war industries faced many difficulties. Hostility and harassment from male workers, childcare seldom was provided, mothers had to find inadequate childcare, send children to live with relatives, older children became latchkey kids to kind of look after the younger kids, wives had to do all the housework and childcare after a full day's work, exhaustion led to absenteeism and forced many to quit. With both parents working, adolescents were unsupervised. There was a rise in teenage delinquency and petty crime. The war created the largest redistribution of wealth in American history. The wealthy lost most of their annual incomes through high taxation. This money was redistributed to other Americans as wages in war industries. Full employment meant that a huge number of American families gained better incomes. Wives were able to work as well. People worked long overtime hours that doubled or tripled paychecks. Farm incomes rose rapidly too. However, there was little to spend the money on. Few consumer goods were being manufactured, and rationing limited purchases. New housing was not being built. So, most disposable income went into savings and buying war bonds. The war created the largest middle class in U.S. history, with money accumulated to buy a house, appliances, and a car after the war. This huge consumer demand for housing and durable consumer goods helped transition to a peacetime economy. The post-war GI Bill kept millions of veterans out of the workforce by giving them a college education that enabled them to join the middle class, and the GI Bill also enabled them to afford to buy a house. So it set the U.S. economy up for really its golden age years after World War II in the late 40s and 50s. And we'll get to that later on, but for the meantime, that's all we have here for World War II. So see you in the next lesson.